Hi everyone, happy Tuesday. This is a demo of basically just using watercolors to color in a coloring book. I wanted to try this after last week's demos where did I use watercolors? No, last week was Galaxy Fox. Not Galaxy Fox, that was the other one. Snow Fox. Um, but I had mentioned a couple weeks ago that I wanted to try just using watercolors in a coloring book just on their own without any pencils or anything on top of them. So I decided to try them in the 50 Jungle Miniatures, which is part of my 10 books to finish this year. You can see here I am using a treatment on these pages. After using the ink tints last month, I have a pretty good sense of what the paper does when no treatment is used. And because these are watercolors and I want to be able to blend and play with them a little bit and be able to activate them easily, I wanted to treat the paper. So I decided I thought this was just going to be one picture, and my first attempt was using the Daniel Smith watercolor ground, which I thought I had taken a picture of, but evidently I did not. That is the first treatment I tried on this page. It is a liquid, and it makes the paper like really textury, like watercolor paper textury, very rough paper. I personally am not a huge fan of that, of the way that felt with the paper. If I did want to use pencil or anything, I feel like it probably would have made any pencil very dusty. It probably would have been a little difficult to try to do anything else on. So I wouldn't recommend using it, especially if you're going to use any sort of mixed media, maybe if you're just going to use straight watercolors. Now, these are the CRBRON watercolors that I bought last year. They were on a lightning deal. I think they're available for about $30 now. There's a set, it's a set of 48. I wanted a set with more initial colors just because I'm new to watercolors and I'm not 100% on being able to mix them yet. And I have been trying these watercolors all through this month just to see. I guess I really should just do like a summary review of these watercolors, and I feel like I probably can after these pictures, but that'll probably come later in the month. So I am using a regular watercolor brush. Even with the treated paper, I did want to try to limit how much water I was using just to see how it would do. Now, one of the things I noticed about the watercolor ground is that it not only left a very rough texture on the paper, it made the paper already very crinkly. So my guess is there's quite a bit of water already mixed into this, and so that comes into play later on, as you'll see when I actually try to do a little bit of blending. That does come into play later on. So here I am pulling from the palette. I just used, oh, where's my swatch? My swatch disappeared on me. Just stick it up here. Who knows? My stuff is a little messy today. Anyway, obviously I used a yellow and it came out as a really bright yellow on paper. I'll say that it definitely, so the watercolor ground I feel like did its job in that it didn't soak into the paper. It created a barrier between the paper and the watercolors. If you're not too familiar with using water-based mediums on Amazon paper, it is very thirsty type paper. The printer paper is, and if you're trying to blend watercolors or trying not to leave streaks, it works that way with alcohol markers too. It dries really fast, so you have to work very quickly to not leave streaks. It makes blending very difficult with watercolors. It makes it quite a bit of challenge with markers as well. So that is why I use the watercolor ground here. This is really my first time, other than like basing a picture in watercolor, that I've tried just coloring a picture entirely using watercolors. So um, I did grab a bigger brush because of the size of the background. In retrospect, I probably should just used a smaller brush. I can't remember what size that brush is. Where'd you go? Now, the types of brushes I'm using, it looks like it says 12 on it. Maybe. The These are not high-end watercolor brushes. I think I bought them as part of a set that was part of a lightning deal a few years ago. They seem to work well enough. So, being a beginner, this is, as I've said, the reason why I call these demos instead of tutorials. I'm very much a beginner, and most of these are just kind of showing you guys what I come across as I use these products, so that hopefully you won't make the same, maybe you won't make the same mistakes as I do. And you can tell here, it did the job in creating kind of a barrier, but I don't think it did as good a job as the Satin Glazing Liquid, which is the second thing I end up using. I come back to try to add in a little bit of like a light orange and kind of a yellow gold color into the background, and it did not, it dried fairly quickly, but it didn't seem to do a really good job of reactivating the watercolor, which again to me feels like didn't create as much of a I it didn't create as much of a barrier to the paper as I wanted. So they're gonna, this turned from one picture into two, because after I got done with this one, I was frustrated because it did not turn out the way I wanted it to. And I couldn't tell if that was due to the watercolor ground, if that was due to the watercolors, or that was just due to my newness with using them in this way. So that's why you get two pictures today and two different types of treatments. The second one goes a lot better, and I am way more pleased with the second picture than I am the first. Though I do love this one I kind of adopted what I like to call the Lisa Frank color palette, where instead of just using the typical colors you would expect, I paint use all kinds of wacky colors, like the cheetah's purple, and all the fruits are different. I don't know, it's coconut or fruit. They're all different colors than what they're supposed to be. So, all right, we're going to speed up the background part, and we're going to get to, I think, the cheetah, which is what I start off with here. We just jumped straight past the background. I'm trying to be aware and conscious of, I have more video this time than I usually do. So, okay, so I decided to go with unconventional colors for this one. I don't know, I was just feeling like the cheetah needed to be purple. And so I just kind of built my palette off that, coloring everything else different colors. So here you can see me, I am using a lot more water with the cheetah than I did the background. And again, this is part of me learning. This is why this is a demo. I am learning how to do this. I feel like I've used the watercolor ground once before, but it's been a very long time, and I don't remember what I was using with that. I can't remember if it was watercolors or pencils or watercolor pencils, what have you. Anyway, I wanted this part of his body to be the lighter purple color that I have. So I was trying to use more water along with using a lighter color. And as you can see, I do get that nice little bead that you want using watercolors, and that worked out really well. But I got done with it and I was like, this looks really splotchy. It actually looks a lot better on the camera than it did on when I was looking at it. I just didn't, it was too thin. I didn't like it. So I come back through with another layer. And one thing I noticed with, so one of the downsides, even if you treat Amazon paper, one thing to keep in mind that if it makes the paper wavy, you're going to have a bit of a problem with the watercolors settling into those little divots that kind of happen. So if the paper dries very crinkly and there's a lot of little rises and falls in the paper, when you use watercolor, with a lot of water and not as much pigment, watercolor tends to want to run and settle in places. And generally on watercolor paper, you don't have that waviness, usually. Depends on what type of paper you're using. But on this paper, if it's really wavy, it might settle in places you don't want it to settle. And I end up running into this problem a lot. And where I'm not looking as much for a watercolor effect as I'm looking for better coverage, at least on the base layer. And so that was one thing I ran into that I would say to people is, if you're going to use a paper treatment for watercolor and you don't want it to just, pull and bubble up into weird little spaces on the paper, I would try to use a treatment that keeps the paper as flat as possible still. So, but yeah, no, this turned, it felt streaky. The watercolor ground, and maybe I used too thick of a coat. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it because I use the same type of layer with my satin glazing liquid in terms of thickness, and I didn't seem to have nearly as many issues. I just think it's probably the watercolor ground to this paper is not helpful for me in what I'm trying to do. So I think that was my first problem was this type of treatment for on Amazon paper does not work well for me. It, like I said, it went ahead and made the paper super wavy. I didn't feel like I could go back and activate dried watercolor as much as I wanted to, and it just, when it dried and then I tried to put the watercolor over it, you could see marks on you could see it on the paper where it, especially on a stomach, where the texture of the paper is now showing through. So I wasn't super pleased. But what I'm going to do is bounce to, trying to figure out, we're going to speed this part up, and then we're going to get to the fruit, because while the Cheetah didn't go quite the way I wanted, and it's also another thing to keep in mind with this, you want to really be conscious of how much water you're using, because this will not only settle into, like I said, the little divots and stuff that kind of happen when this paper gets wet and it dries all wavy, but if you use too much water, it might even drip outside the lines. And again, what you may want in a watercolor painting in terms of how you want the watercolor to react may not necessarily be the same way you want it to act in coloring a picture like this, which is the case for me. So I had a lot of instances where it would pull like right outside the lines, and I would have to come in with a paper towel and try to dab it away, because it would just create a giant mess if I didn't do that. And you can kind of see on the paw, on that left paw right there, really how it's settling in different areas. So alright, let me speed this part up and we'll get to the fruits, because I try a little bit different tactic when we get to the fruits, and I have a little more success. All right, so the cheetah I fought with and fought with and fought with, and I finally just got to the point where I just left it alone for the moment because things were not going well. So with the fruit, I got to thinking, and I was like, all right, well, we're gonna try a different way of doing this. Instead of trying to use a good solid pigmented layer to start with, I'm just going to come in with a really light layer of watercolor. So my goal with a fruit was, or again, I can't remember if coconut's a fruit. Anyway, the various things he's juggling, my goal was to try to build up the layers and then use the reactivation of previous layers to my advantage when trying to bring it all together. And this probably sounds obvious to anybody that's used watercolors. But again, keep in mind, I am very new to using these, and most of the time I'm used to just using a light layer as a base coat, but I'm not used to coming back in and actually using them to build up color. So this was a fun little challenge for me, and like I said, I wasn't thrilled with how this first picture went, but the second picture turned out so much better. So my takeaway from this is that don't give up on it if it's something you really want to try and you're trying to challenge yourself. Even if it doesn't turn out all that great to start with, maybe try it again. And just, I had a lot better luck on my second picture. Actually, this was where I started finding how using watercolor in these books works best for me. Was on these. The layering technique was what I need to do. It's what works well for me, and so it just took some effort, and it was, I had to use a heat gun quite a bit to speed up the drying in between layers, just because I wanted to keep working at it. But to be fair, it really wasn't taking that long to dry. Again, I don't know if the watercolor ground really did as good a job. Like, I feel like some of the paper probably still did come through in terms of the paper properties, because it did seem like it dried awful quickly. Well, I say that, but it did that with satin glazing liquid too. When you're just using light layers like this, it probably does dry a lot quicker. Plus, the lighter layers gave me less opportunity for the pigment to kind of shift in the ways I didn't want it to shift. So, now I do fight with this pineapple quite a bit though. The color I used for the base versus the leaves, like one was bleeding into the other. If you really wanted, I would say, if you really wanted to be careful, I'm going to try to summarize all this at the end, just in case people have been skipping around, which I completely understand. We all have very limited time to get to look at stuff, so it won't hurt my feelings none. I completely get it. But I would say, if you are really meticulous about making sure your paint stays where it's supposed to be, and making sure it doesn't bleed into other paint, and doesn't, if you activate close to another color and it kind of bleeds into yours a little bit, I mean, that's the nature of watercolor. But if you're really trying to avoid that, and use watercolor in a different way, then what I would recommend is working very slowly with a heat gun. Each time you complete a little section or whatever it is you want to complete, and you want that pigment to stay there, do that, then come in and hit it with the heat gun and dry it before proceeding to the next thing. So in this example, what I should have done was, with the pineapple itself, I should have dried that before I started the leaves, because I did use more water on the pineapple itself, and so what happens is that blue tries to bleed into that orange a little bit, and it gives you a nice pretty mud color. Now, I was able to use a paper towel and kind of dab my way out of that. But I would say the learning there is less water is better. Those lighter layers I was talking about, and thoroughly drying sections before you move to another section. Now, if you treat the paper like this, you'll probably still activate the other color some if you get too close to it, but it won't be as severe as if you had just done like I did here. So this orange is probably going to pull up. It's going to meld with that teal color, and then it's going to get kind of blobby there in the middle. And like I said, I was able to dab it away and successfully fix it, but that is something, even on treated paper, you want, if you don't want things to bleed in very much with each other, then your heat gun's going to be your friend. So, what do I do here? You can start to see it there right at the base of the leaves on the pineapple. And again, I mean, I'm basically trying to make watercolors do what they're go against their nature, so to speak. I tend to not be as freewheeling with letting stuff blend and whatnot as I should be with watercolors, because those tend to be a more flowy kind of medium. I tend to just want my colors to stay into place, like where I put them. Um, so I would probably be better served using watercolor pencils, but I I kind of want to challenge myself a little, and I want to be able to grow a bit, and I want to be okay with the fluidness of flat out watercolors, because that's just something I want to challenge myself with to get better at. And see, you can see that nice little muddy puddle forming right there. And part of that too was just the paper being wavy and it pulling together like that. So anyway, I wanted to show you guys that. We'll probably speed up through the rest of it, but what I end up doing is I come back through on these, and where I really, well, let's speed it up to the point where I show you guys kind of where the light bulb went off for me. Let's do that. So I actually jumped forward a bit, went back over the coconut with another layer. It was still too much water, and I did it with the blue fruit too, whatever that's supposed to be. Again, still too much water with that darker middle layer. But I wanted to fast forward to here because this is really where I think I figured out how to make this work the way I want it to work. I came back to this pineapple, and as you can see, I'm using a really darker, less watery, pigmented part of the watercolor to just basically create like a very dark outline on the picture. So I do that, I let it dry, and then when I come back, I'll run water over that. And while the watercolor ground doesn't, in my opinion, do as great a job reactivating it as the satin glazing liquid, it still did a good enough job to where I was able to activate that outline, make it blend a little bit into the layer underneath to kind of get that mid-tone. So all of a sudden, I finally was able to get get the look that I was trying to go for. And once I figured it out on this pineapple, it's just, I think using watercolor in here, if you want to just use the watercolor, it's time consuming. I still think probably the watercolor base and pencil on top is going to be a faster way to color a page. If you start just having to do layers and then letting them dry of watercolors, I think it takes more time. It took me more time than I anticipated. But I also got to the point I was really enjoying doing it in the second picture. So it really comes down to what your goal is. Do you want something that you enjoy doing, or are you looking for something that gives you the most enjoyment for the least amount of time? Sometimes I feel one way, sometimes I feel another. so, so I'm going to speed up the remaining of this till we get to the final picture. Here I am. The only things I really do other than the watercolor is I use this Pitt artist pen like I did at the beginning to do the outline, fill in the eyes. I also outline him. One thing with watercolors is that sometimes they can wash out the line art underneath. And I really like the look when I go back over some of the items with the artist pen, go back over the black line art. It really makes it pop, and you'll see that happen with the cheetah. But in the sped up part, you'll see me use that outlining technique on the other fruit. You'll see me go back and activate it, so you'll see what I'm talking about, and you'll see me finish up the picture. And then we will take a quick look at it before we get to the next one. So here we go. So here we are with finished picture number one. As you saw, I kind of figured out what I was doing with the watercolor, at least in the top part of the picture, and I feel a lot better about that than I do poor little cheetah boy. But overall, it still turned out a pretty cute picture, and it was fun to try something different. So on to the next one. So I started this one before I hit record. Um, the treatment, the way I did the paper was the same way. I used it's called Golden Satin Glazing Liquid, and I will put it down in the description. I put that on the page, probably about the same layer as the watercolor ground. It did not dry as rough. It actually has a little bit of a smoother texture to it, and I don't feel like it wrinkled the paper as much from the get go. So there is that. Now, I did not draw out a background with this one because of the size of the picture. And I'm actually doing this one for Froggy February, which is a color along that Coloring with Haley is hosting. But with this page, with the size of the frogs and the puddle and everything, and how it would go into the very crease, I just didn't think being able to do that background was going to be an easy an easy endeavor. So I just decided I was going to do the whole background, and so why not? There wouldn't be that much extra paper or extra page or what have you. So I ended up using a brown ochre for the background. I was going to use brown ochre and like a golden brown, and this was interesting. So the finished picture I am very pleased with, but man, let me tell you, the whole time I had my colors already picked out for the rest of the picture, and I wanted something neutral in the background. And the whole time I was putting this down on the paper, I'm like, man, this just looks like poop brown. This looks terrible. The whole time. I was like, this just looks so bad. And, but the satin glazing liquid, I felt like did a really good job of keeping the paper wetter longer. And once I kind of figured out what I was doing, I was able to go back in. I ended up doing 2 layers of the background. The initial one that you're seeing here, I had to work at it a little bit, just again, trying to get used to a consistent amount of water and pigment. That is something I'm still learning, and in some places on the page, I noticed it seemed like there was a lot more pigment and less water, and it just looked very inconsistent to me, which it probably isn't the worst thing in the world, but it was bugging me. So I had to go back and rework some sections just to make it look more consistent overall. And the satin glazing liquid seemed to hold up really well to that without making the paper like really, really, really crinkly bad. So again, as a beginner, I'm just gonna have to get used to figuring out my consistency with how much pigment and how much water I use. But yeah, no, this whole time I was just like, it's poop brown, it looks terrible. But I am gonna speed it up here in a second. You're seeing me finish out the first layer. I probably come in and with the second layer I even it out, and it was of course already drying towards the top, and it was really nice because I was able to easily go in and reactivate what was already there. And I did try to blend in the darker brown a little bit. Probably would have had more success if I kept at it, but what little I was able to work in, I feel like did really well. But as you can see, it just the satin glazing liquid just feels so much different than the watercolor ground, and it felt easier to work on for me. Again, that is, I am not going to sit here and say don't ever use watercolor ground, use this instead. But for me and what I'm used to, and it may come down the road, I prefer to use the other. But for what I was trying to accomplish here, the satin glazing liquid was able to perform better for me without as many issues. So, all right, let's speed this up a little bit. So still kind of poop brown looking, but maybe not as bad. And with a little bit of the darker brown mixed in, it actually turns out quite nice. And I felt really comfortable reworking it and reworking it with the glazing liquid on it. I didn't feel like the paper was getting super crinkly on me. I didn't feel like it was a super rough texture, and you could see the texture through the paint. It just, overall, I had a really much more pleasant experience with the satin glazing liquid than I did the watercolor ground. So now you're going to see me start in on the actual foreground on the picture. My strategy is to use the tactic, the approach that I figured out in the last, towards the end of the last picture, and use just a very light base layer across the whole picture. Then come back in and do a darker outline with less water and more pigment, and then and let it dry in between, and then come in that third time to activate that dark outline and create kind of the blend look that I was looking for. I do still have a little bit of pooling happening, where again the paper's still just a little bit crinkly, and so watercolor being watercolor, it kind of runs and pulls up into different little areas, and that wasn't really what I was looking for with the initial layer. But then I was more okay with it as I went on with the other layers, I guess, just because it's, you know, nothing's gonna look super consistent in pigment anyway. So I end up going with a blue frog, kind of blue and purple frog palette. So let's zoom through the base layer on everything, and then we'll hop to the next part. Yeah, the second one, as you can tell, is going to go a lot quicker because you guys have already heard me kind of explain what I'm doing here. Now, there were a couple places where the satin glazing liquid maybe didn't, either it was too thick or it was too thin, and so I'd get a little bit of that weird texture look from the paper underneath, or it just wouldn't, the pigment didn't want to stay on it. It was really weird. Like, you can kind of see it there on that leaf on that flower. I did have a few little issues, but still not to the level I feel like I have with the watercolor ground. Alright, so here I am with the base layer on everything done, and now I'm coming in. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to hit the mic there. So in some cases, I played around with maybe a slightly darker color on the palette. For some of them, I just used the same color, but obviously it's going to be more pigmented on the edges. Just kind of played around with that. I didn't really create any of my own colors on this. I mostly just stuck with what's in my palette. Again, as I noted, I'm not really knowledgeable about mixing colors very well yet. And because I was having trouble figuring out how much watercolor I needed, like when I was putting it on the palette, I knew if I mixed a color, I wouldn't mix enough. And so then I'd run into a problem where I'd probably have 2 or 3 different colors because I'd have to remix it over and over again. I'm not quite ready for that level yet. Now the outlining does take some practice. I have to find the level of pigment versus water where it is not super wet or pooling. Where it's not super wet or anything like that, and but I have to have enough water on it so that it doesn't so that I can get a smooth line. So that part is a little tricky, and I definitely need more practice with that. But it is possible. One thing I was pleased with, I have noted that these watercolors have felt a bit chalky to me before on the paper. And where is the other page? I just had you. Hi, Reap Sheep. And on the previous page, I mean, I can't really feel them because the watercolor ground just makes the texture of the paper really rough anyway. But with the satin glazing liquid and with the layers that I use, they don't feel chalky nearly as bad on this picture. And I thought that was really nice. I still think there are probably better watercolor palettes for better deals out there. But if you are looking for one that has quite a few colors in it so you don't have to do a lot of mixing to start out with, and you're just maybe looking for something to do light base coats or building up layers like this, these seem like a pretty good starter set. They're growing on me the more I use them, which is why I use them a lot before I do an official review on anything, because usually my first impressions always end up being more like maybe user error or something before I actually get used to using them. So this outlining is a pretty slow process, but we will of course speed it up. So here we go. Alright, so quickly I wanted to show you where I go through and activate. There we go. Where I activate this little darker line of pigment. Now again, I do want to note that I am doing this in stages and layers, and I'm always trying to make sure the bottom layer is dry before I put the top layer on, because obviously if I didn't, it would go ahead and start mixing when that's not really what I want it to do. So, hi, Reef Sheep. Are you saying hello to everybody? Say hello. Beep. Oh, there's one ring. Beep. Beep. Okay, well that was probably more him than you wanted to hear. He was rubbing against the mic. So I just come in with a little bit of water, basically just rub over that line and kind of dab it in. Now, I wasn't always super successful, but in some cases it's a little more subtle, like it is here on the top of this frog, but you'll really see it here on the bottom of the frog, because I used a phthalo blue instead of like a lake blue. I believe the lake blue was the initial base color, and then I used that phthalo blue as the outline. Now again, here I have to be control my water and be very careful with it. A lot of times I'm having to dab onto a towel off screen, onto a paper towel, to remove the water, because again, this is where I want more control, and I don't necessarily want it super flowy from one color to the next. I do want to create some highlights and stuff. So you can see on the bottom of the bottom face of the frog, like where it is kind of blending out and then it's creating a little bit of a line. So what I kind of do is go back in a little bit and do what I can to erase that line to make it seem more fluid, more flowy, if that. I'm sure there are technical terms for this in the watercolor world. But I'm just telling y'all what I'm doing. So now I probably should be using, again, a smaller brush for this, but see, just like that. And it looks this is the look I wanted. It really is. This is exactly what I was looking for. And I was so tickled that I figured it out. So, all right, so we are going to speed it up again, because we are getting close to the hour mark, and let you guys watch me do the rest of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate the outlines like this, and then kind of mess with it a little bit to, like I said, get rid of those weird little kind of lines that show up. And then I come back in and I outline the frogs in that pit pen again, because I really like that look. And again, I feel like the watercolor kind of washes that out a little bit, and sometimes a natural look's okay, but sometimes I just want certain elements to pop. And I didn't really want to use like a bunch of stickles in this, and they're great and I use them all the time, but for these pictures I just wanted something, I guess, a little more subtle. So for either picture I didn't really use any any stickles or real glitter. I'm gonna get it one of these days. Glittery elements to them. So let's speed it up. You'll see me do that. Outline them in the pit pens. Their eyes, I do use the dual metallic gel pens, and then I use a little bit of white gel pen on the water. And then when we get to the end of this picture, we will talk about the finished picture and my final thoughts on it all. So here we go. So here we are with the finished version of this picture, and I really like it. Like I can't tell you, I was iffy on it till about halfway through, and then it just all seemed to really start coming together. Um, I did go back and use a marker to outline the leaves and the flowers again a little bit, just to give it that little bit extra effect. And I like how that turned out too. And just overall, this picture turned out so much better than the other one for me. It was so much more enjoyable to actually color it, and it felt, I don't know, like I really enjoyed the process. So final thoughts on this: the CRBRON watercolors are growing on me. Are they high end watercolors? No. Um, they're probably not the best budget choice either. However, the best budget friendly ones either. However, I do like the fact that they come in 48 colors because I'm very new to watercolor and I'm not super comfortable mixing colors yet. So this gives me more color variety. Um, they seem to go on the paper really nice when you use treatment on the paper, and or use very light layers of them. They are not very chalky. However, if you do use a pretty thick pigmented layer, they can get a little chalky. However, I didn't experience any of that on the treated paper. So overall, the I think I will be using these watercolors. I ordered another set that I'm going to use next month in comparison. I have some other sets to use, but I don't think I'm going to be getting rid of these because they seem to be doing the job pretty darn well. And as far as treating Amazon paper, the only thing I didn't try is clear gesso. I do have that, but the watercolor ground, which I guess you would think would perform better, didn't really give me what I needed. It made the texture of the paper extremely rough. Had I wanted to use other mixed media, it probably would have been difficult to use pencils or markers on it. The watercolor ground didn't seem to protect the paper as well. It got a lot wavier, a lot more crinkly at the onset, which made it harder to keep the watercolor within the lines and contained like I wanted it to. And it also caused weird texture issues where it wasn't completely smooth. The texture of the paper would show through where the watercolor was at. So I will use it. I may use it for paper, like if I want to do a watercolor picture or something, and I'll probably try it again in the future. But hands down, the best one out of the two for me was the Satin Glazing Liquid. I think it was a combination of it left a smoother result on the paper. I feel like it protected the paper better, and I was a little more. I learned a lot from the first picture that I did. So I feel like it was a combination of all those elements. But overall, I enjoyed this process. It turned out to take longer and be a little more tedious when working in layers. But if you want a controlled look, and let's say you just want to use watercolor on your coloring pages and you want to have a controlled look and you want to have a blended look, I would say use treatment on your paper. Mine was the Satin Glazing Liquid. That's my choice. And work in layers and be sure to thoroughly dry between layers. It also did The Satin Glazing Liquid did a really good job of keeping it so that I could go reactivate the watercolor from previous layers when I wanted to. Less water is more, goes further in terms of control and keeping it from bleeding outside the lines. Obviously in a watercolor painting, you want a little bit more free form. You want the color to move and shift like that. But in a situation where you have a coloring book page with lines, you may not want that look. That wasn't what I was going for. So I found less water worked out a lot better for me in terms of keeping everything contained where it belongs. So, anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope this was useful. Working in layers did make it take longer, but at the end of the day, I was enjoying it. So, I mean, I was enjoying the process, and I can see myself definitely doing this in the future. It really was not that much trouble to put one layer of the satin glazing liquid on. It was a rather thin coat with a regular acrylic paintbrush, and yeah, it seemed like it worked really well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed seeing the reason I made this so long instead of just showing the second pictures. I want you guys to see where I trip up and where I run into issues, and then where I also have my successes, because again, I am trying these out, hopefully helping people that may be otherwise intimidated to try this stuff see how it goes and maybe encourage other people to try this as well. I'll be curious to do this again in the future, and it, like I said, this was a lot of fun. So, and my Froggy February picture turned out fabulous, so I'm very pleased about that. Well, thanks for watching. I may actually be back either tomorrow or Thursday with some new releases if they actually show up on time. I'm supposed to have two new release books show up tomorrow, but we're going to hold our breath. One of them's Endless Summer by George Soufexis. What is the other one? Oh, Whimsical Cats is also a Creative Haven book by, well, I'm not going to say who it's by because I don't want to say the wrong name. But I will be doing flip throughs of those as soon as I get those. Friday, we'll probably be doing flip throughs of the books I got from the Amazon 3 for 2 sale. And then I have a coloring chat planned for Sunday, and we'll see how things go past that. Hope you guys have a good rest of the week. Let me know in the comments if you've tried watercolor before. Feel free to share your experiences. My next demo, I'm thinking I'm going to use the Jane Davenport pastels because somebody did request that. So if there's something you guys would like to see, feel free to request it. I may not get to it quickly, like within the next week or something, but I definitely do try to do those when my schedule allows and when I'm kind of in the mood to use them. So thanks, guys, and talk to you soon. Bye for now.